Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week I have a very special guest, Sally Davis, an international woman of mystery. What can you tell us about what you do, Sally?
So I work for the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in the UK. I write software in support of wargaming and analysis and simulation. So basically people give me cool toys like VR and AR and stuff and say, what can you do with this in Unity? And I make cool stuff to kind of help with decision support things.
Fantastic. So nobody ever seems to come to wargaming by a straight path towards wargaming. You yourself have a degree in rocket science. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So I did rocket science at uni. I finished at just about the time when there were no jobs in rocket science. So I had a brief stint at a space science museum. And the first people to offer me a job was DSTL. And I started out doing aircraft vulnerability and lethality modeling. And so that's like, if you throw something at this aircraft, what breaks, what falls off, does it fall out the sky? And to do that, I had to learn how to code. And then I got to be more useful as a coder than someone who does the analysis. And I got sucked sideways into wargaming to support computer-assisted wargame called the Peace Support Operations Model that you can Google for because it's unclassed in places.
All right. So had you ever been a gamer before that, or was this sort of a surprise to you?
So I'd played some board games. I had a disastrous experience of D&D as a 7-year-old where I died before we even entered the dungeon, and that pretty much put me off. Never play D&D with your brothers. And yeah, so joining the possum team was a little bit like, I know how to write code. I have no idea what's going on here. I can't make any sensible decisions in this game. So I learned a lot very quickly about what all the things the code was doing meant.
Have you developed a love for gaming now?
I like it. I don't do as much of it as I want to because there always seems to be so many other things to do, and can never seem to get people together to play. Like I'm not so into the sort of like the tactical side. I have no experience, and that sort of wargaming is like I don't know enough to be good at it, so it's a little bit like I'm flailing here, and everyone thinks I'm being a bit of an idiot, and I'm not fun to play against. I'm much more into the kind of storytelling side of things, or games that don't involve thinking too hard.
So you're more of a Matrix game person than a read 3 rule books and play for 6 hours sort of person.
I mean, my favorite board game is Rampage, where you literally get to throw the pieces at the board. So yeah, I'm not very good at making mathematical judgments. So I tend to lose at games that involve me knowing whether I have more soldiers than the other side. So that puts me at a disadvantage for many board games that are sort of wargaming.
All right, so let's talk about how that can be. You know, you're a rocket scientist, but you also dislike in the moment mathematical judgments, and that's not as unusual as one would think. So do you want to talk about your educational background and how this came to be?
Well, so like there's a difference between maths and arithmetic, and you can totally understand hardcore maths without being able to do simple maths. And I'm dyslexic, and I just suck at mental arithmetic and that kind of number sense stuff. So I can look at the risk board and it's like, yeah, I'm going to win this fight. No, that was a bad move. And so it's really, it's a weird thing understanding things but not being able to do them, and then having that constant, does that mean I understand it? I don't know. If I can't prove that I understand it, do I really get it?
But so what attracted you to studying rocket science if you probably had some unpleasant experiences in math class as a kid?
Oh God, I totally did. I nearly got expelled for being so bad at maths and people thinking I was a troublemaker. I guess I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, we do a thing called work experience when you're kind of 15, 16-ish, where you spend a couple of weeks out of the school year doing a real job somewhere to kind of get an idea of what work is actually like. And the way they tend to do it is you get thrown at some random local employer, and it's not necessarily anything to do with what you're interested in. So my school had a scheme where later, like 2 years later, in the sixth form, you do one that you organized yourself that was supposed to be somewhere you were interested in. And I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know where I want to work. I'm going to send an email to NASA. And like, didn't really take it very seriously and forgot all about it. And then I got a reply saying, yeah, come to Johnson Space Center for 2 weeks and we'll show you the ropes. So I spent 2 weeks just like, it was the best. Like, got to see everything. Sort of spent like an afternoon in every different department, meeting all these people. And the woman who got my email, like she was really smart and just sort of like found all the women. And she didn't really make a big deal of it, but I got to see women doing all the things and got a sneaky message that you can do any of these things. It's not just for guys. So that was really cool. And I went for engineering at uni, and it was kind of aerospace astronautics course. And while I was out on industrial placement with Astrium, my course got cancelled under me. So I came back to where I'd been on an aerospace course. It had split into straight aeronautics and straight astronautics. So I got to finish my final year by just picking whatever I wanted. So just all the rocket science. And it was awesome.
That is actually super awesome. So you got to work for NASA as a kid?
I mean, they didn't pay me, but yeah, I trained some astronauts. I met some astronauts. I spoke to some astronauts that were on space station at the time. I did a bit of, and anytime you saw them. And it turns out looking at a black screen with some stars, watching for moving stars, just makes you hallucinate after a couple of hours. And you're like, wait, was that one? Was that not one? I can't remember. Rewind a bit. Oh no, I'm just making it up.
Did you get to try any of the astronaut food? I've just always been curious.
Yeah, and like all the different kind of weightlessness things. Didn't get to go in the Vomit Comet, but like they have a whole bunch of different zero-G simulations. Like there's an air-bearing floor, so it's like a giant air hockey table like that on a little jetpack chair, and got to see the giant swimming pool where they do the spacewalk training, and yeah, just all the things. It was so good.
I now see exactly why you would go be a rocket scientist. That's awesome.
Yeah, I want to do that.
I want to focus in on something you've said, which I think is really important, which is that a woman decided to reach out to you, and she was making a point of finding other girls who might be interested in doing this job. And I feel like that's work that you're starting to contribute to within Wargaming. And you've been a lot more, I think, upfront about it this year. So do you want to start talking? You're responsible in part for the Derby House principles. What are those?
First of all, I have to correct your pronunciation. It's Darby House,
Darby.
not Derby House. So, Connections North. So that's Professional Wargaming Conference. This time last year, the upshot of that was Rex Brynan and Una Wong and myself and Tom Mowat and Kira Bentley from the UK got together and wrote the Derby House principles, like statement of diversity and inclusion in professional wargaming, and convinced a whole bunch of people that they should sign up to this as a bit of peer pressure to get other people to start treating women and minorities better than they had been, because there's been a lot of really ugly things happening to women and minority wargamers, particularly on Facebook and from kind of hobby community. So it's sort of professional wargaming leading the way to try and influence some of that hobby community behavior as well, if we can.
To what extent do you feel that professional wargaming and hobby wargaming are connected or co-influential?
That's a really interesting question. I think that there's a subset of hobby gamers that want to be professional gamers and don't know how. and feel a little bit like there are gatekeepers and they can't figure out how to get in. In terms of the professional wargamers that I work with, most of us haven't come from a hobby background explicitly. There's a lot of kind of D&D background, storytelling background. It's weird. It's like similar but different. And you certainly don't need to be a hobby gamer to become a professional wargamer. And in some cases, it's actually better that you have a completely different background, because you bring something new to the table where everybody at the wargame knows how to wargame. So if all you know how to do is wargaming, you're bringing nothing.
Interesting. That's a really good way to look at it. But if that's the case, so why is it important for professional wargaming to lay out something like Darby House principles in a way that also trickles down into hobbyist play?
So there's a kind of role modeling going on, so that the idea that you can get paid to play these games, and we do use commercial off-the-shelf games. So the fact that it is like it has meaning and value, I guess, to the hobby community. And a lot of us do play war games and board games socially as well as for work. So there's an interaction there. Like there'll be people that I play games with that aren't people that I work with. And it's a different demographic. So a lot of the professional gamer, it's more white and male. And in the hobby space, there are places where there's much more diversity. So there's a lot more diversity, kind of university wargaming clubs. But there's also a lot more of the sort of extreme, we don't want women and minorities here in the hobby community. So sort of, I guess it probably evens out in the end.
So in some ways, by connecting professional and hobby wargaming, there's also the chance, especially with something that's an overture to diversity and inclusion, the way the Darby House principles are, that could maybe attract people from more diverse groups into
it's
the
a way to say
field.
You're welcome here and we want you here. Because when you look at a group of people that don't look like you, unless they're actively saying we support women and minorities, how are they going to know that they're welcome? It looks like they're not welcome.
Have you found a difference in reception of the Darby House principles between fellow pros and hobbyists?
The kind of overwhelming response to the professional community is like, yeah, this makes sense. Of course it does. Diversity of thought is good. We're behind that. The vocal end of hobby gaming has been very, take this woke nonsense out of here. You're making it an issue by talking about it. And probably half of that is directed at me because I'm a woman saying it. And the other half is just like, we don't want discussion of D&I because that's somehow a threat to some people who think it will destroy the hobby for them rather than just, make it better for everyone.
So you've written about this some. Why is it so important to speak up? Can't you just take actions that indicate how you feel, or is it more important to actually get the words out there as well?
I think it's both. So that there's kind of, when you're trying to influence people about D&I issues, there's 20% that you're never going to reach because they're just militantly against it. There's 20% that are already on your side and agree with everything you're saying. And then there's 60% that are influenceable either way by the messages they hear. So you can be totally pro D&I and support women and minorities. But if you don't say anything and you don't act in ways that support that, all the women and minorities are going to hear are the trolls shouting loudly, we don't want you here, go away, you're not welcome, you're ruining our hobby. And that sends a really strong message. So a lot of the work I've been trying to do is to get the 20% and the 60% that are coming on board to be more vocal in just amplifying messages or saying I support these messages or doing things that show they support the message. So wearing Darby House pins is a really easy way for people to show that they support stuff. And it make you walk into a room and you see people wearing these pins and you know who your friends are, even though you've never met these people. And just trying to convince people to speak up more rather than assume everybody knows that you're a decent human being that supports this stuff. And it's difficult for people. And it's quite scary because you don't want to say the wrong thing, and like you don't want people to yell at you from either side. And there's a fear of like, this isn't my space, I'm intruding. But actually the women and minorities are like, please God, somebody else speak up for us, so it's not just us doing the work all the time. So it feels really scary to do it, but when you do it, you realize the world isn't going to end, and it's a really positive thing to do.
So are people finding that when they speak up, they generally get more good responses than bad ones?
I'd like to think they get more good responses. I've been taking the brunt of the trolling because I've been saying things in less safe spaces. But like on our internal social media at work, there's been a really definite shift since last May of people starting to realize that there is a different perspective, where before they would have been like, I'm sure it's not like that. Now they're like, maybe we should listen. Maybe it could be different. And then slowly people are starting to realize that if you're a straight white man, you have so much more influence when you say things. And you can say things and not get the same pushback that a woman or a black person will get for saying exactly the same thing. So it's slowly, but hopefully people are starting to realize that it doesn't, it's not a terrible thing to do, and you won't get inundated by trolls telling you the worst, and that women and minorities won't be like, oh my God, shut up, we don't want you talking about our stuff. In fact, we'll be like, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We know it's hard.
So this year was a big year for you. Not 2021, but 2020. I started noticing articles from you, which is why I contacted you. Was it scary at first for you to decide to speak up and write these articles on major online wargame publications?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely like, what am I doing? Who am I to say any of this? And it's all Rex's fault. He asked me to be a co-editor on Pack Sims. So that's another plus point for men to make spaces for women and minorities to give them the chance to do stuff rather than expecting them to beat the door down and set up their own webpage and all that kind of stuff. So there have certainly been posts that I've made where I've like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job over this, or people are going to really hate me. I'm going to be in so much trouble. And the vast majority of it has not been met with like the worst outrage. Like I've expected embarrassing what they think is a good argument. The waiver room was a little bit more exciting because it has much bigger reach than Pack Sims. And there was a moment when a troll with like 40,000 followers retweeted it, and there were references to Nazis in the comments and replies. I was like, wow, this is getting a little bit out of hand. But that was as bad as it got. And I guess there's that thing about if you're going towards the bullets, you're going in the right direction about computer games. So it's probably a good thing. And that people are a bit upset because I'm saying the right things and challenging the behavior that needs to be challenged.
What would you say to people who are basically like, well, I'm comfortable and I've never seen any of this happen in my group. We welcome anyone at our table. Why are you complaining about a problem that I don't see? What is the response to that?
It's so exhausting having to deal with this stuff. Like, first off, if it is like genuinely, if your Wargaming group is welcoming and inclusive and there are diverse people around you, yay, obviously I'm not whining at you. Like, why is that so difficult for men to understand? And then if it's like you look around and everybody looks like you and went to the same schools you did and does the same kind of jobs you do, it's like, well, how would you know what women think? Or men that are like, women in frontline roles don't mind the banter and don't mind having to be masculine to get along. It's like, well, it's probably in their interest to tell you that they don't mind it so much, because they're going to take so much more rubbish if they do speak up. So I guess the first thing to do would be to look at the diversity card deck that I compiled out of a survey of professional wargamers and women and minorities in national security roles. And this was just vignettes people sent me about how being a woman or a minority had affected them in the workplace. And the number of guys that have read it and be like, whatever. And then their girlfriend has seen it over their shoulder and be like, that one? Yep, that one. Oh my God, all the time, that one. And just that it's like somebody they know and they care about is experiencing this stuff too. And it stops being this nebulous other and it starts being so unreal to them. It's like, it's baffling to me how that leap of empathy doesn't occur to them until that point. But I'm glad that it does happen.
Yeah, you got to get there however you got to get there, I guess. So one thing you said earlier that I thought was a really interesting point that will apply to this as well is that one of the reasons professional wargaming maybe even shouldn't be comprised of mostly hobbyist wargamers is that there's a difference between knowing how to play a war game and having something interesting to contribute to a war game scenario, having a different viewpoint. How is having a more diverse population in professional wargaming going to advance the field? Because I think that it will, but I also think we need to talk about it.
Yeah, so there's like underlying that statement is the sneaky assumption that a lot of bigots have, or unthinking people have, that if you let women and minorities in, that is excluding better qualified men, which is like basically saying women and minorities cannot possibly be equally or more qualified than men. And that's obviously rubbish. And like everybody accepts that diversity of thought makes for better outcomes. And there's really great science study where they had like a murder mystery and they put people together in groups. And if they had a homogeneous group, if they didn't already know the answer, putting in someone that was completely different to the group improved their chances of success by something like 60%. And it made it harder for them to work together. And because it was hard, they had to work harder at communicating, and that's why they did better. When you put people together that know the same things, they use shorthands and shortcuts, and they never question their assumptions, so they don't think about new things. And people from different backgrounds, so women and Black people and queer people and disabled people, have such different life experiences to straight white men who go to the same universities and grow up in the same neighborhoods and do the same kind of jobs, that it's like, it's so I used the analogy on Pax Sims the other day about how, well, Ford Focuses have, you know, all kinds of different diversity. You know, my little red one is all faded in the sun and a little beat up because I'm not that fussed about the state of my car. But actually, there's a much greater kind of diversity among all the different kinds of cars on the road. And the focus on that men are diverse, men have diverse life experiences. Like, it's not untrue. It's just that there's an order of magnitude more out there that we're not reaching, that we need to reach.
So how do you think that we can bring more women, more people of color, more queer people into wargaming in a way that's going to be comfortable for them and not be asking them to tolerate a bunch of difficult behavior from colleagues?
That's such a good question. So, I mean, I think it's several different questions. First of all, you have to be talking to these people to even get them in the door. And so often we're looking to the same Russell Group universities or Ivy League in the US, where all of the diversity has already been weeded out for you. So if you look at the Russell Group universities in the UK, like Oxford and Cambridge, the vast majority of their racial or ethnic diversity is overseas students. And none of those are eligible to work for UK Ministry of Defence. So instantly there's, you know, all we can hire is white people from these universities, pretty much. So we need to be going to places to find people that we're not finding already. We have to find universities with better diversity and speak to them. And that's just so they know to apply. And then we need to make sure that there aren't any kinds of unconscious bias in how we talk about jobs and how we recruit people. And that's really difficult because everybody's kind of, everybody wants to hire someone that's like themselves, not out of any kind of bad intention. It's just, you know, like you get on with people that are like you, and you get a good vibe from people that share your background. And it can be really difficult unless you've sat down and thought about that quite critically to recognize when you're making a decision based on they remind me of me versus they're going to be good at the job, even though they're different to me. And that actually sometimes that friction is a really good thing. Like from that murder mystery science experiment, you want people that make it harder for you to communicate, so you try hard to communicate. And then when you've got people in the door, you need to make the environment okay for them. So there has to be an understanding that there are behaviors that are not cool, and an acceptable way to say what you're doing isn't cool, please stop. That isn't about shaming people, but isn't about leaving the women and minorities to police it or to put up with it while other people learn to do better. And I think we're kind of failing on those two at the moment, where there's an awful lot of women and minorities need to be endlessly patient and endlessly explain to men why they're behaving badly, rather than telling men, stop it right now, do your learning in private, don't do it at the expense of other people. And that's that kind of empathy idea that we're very quick to give the benefit of the doubt to men and white men and straight men, and rarely do we do the same kind of generous behavior in return to women and minorities.
One thing I thought you just said that was very interesting is that we need to be able to correct without shaming. Have you had experience with that you could share? I personally find that difficult, especially if I'm agitated in the moment of correction.
I mean, this is one of the things I'm still looking for, like, how do I do this? Because it's so hard. Even just calling out bad behavior when it's happening, it's difficult, even like in person, to say, hey, that thing you said wasn't cool, please don't do it. Because when you're the only woman in the room, or you're like, so many straight people are just so oblivious to what homophobia and transphobia looks like that they don't even understand that something they've said is just really not cool. And they didn't necessarily mean it that way. And it can be everything from like they meant it badly and they knew it was bad, to they don't understand these words, or they don't understand that these words have context, and this context is a really bad one, to just, like, slip of the tongue, wasn't thinking. And I mean, your first instinct is to be angry at people because, like, what you said is hurtful and that's not cool, but that's not going to change their behavior. So I'm if someone can tell me how to do it well, I will take lessons.
Yeah, my problem is that all I know how to do it with is with students. Because kids, like, it, I'm the adult in the room. So if like kids like, oh,
yeah, so you've got the authority. Yeah.
Right.
And one of my biggest problems is, as a woman in technology and wargaming, like, I don't have that authority in a room. Like, people explain my own projects to me. And so the idea that I can be like, hey, you need to stop that right now. I'm either going to take pushback for being bossy or rude or confrontational, when a guy can do exactly the same, and that's leadership. So, like, it has to be coming from the allies just as much as from the minorities if we're going to change culture. And once you get that kind of head of steam behind it, where the kind of questioning 60% start to feel the peer pressure, everything changes. But getting it going is really, really hard, and it's just going to be uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah, I will say I do think a lot of this, it really does, and it's hard to talk about because we don't like to think about ourselves this way, but it really does come down to peer pressure. Because if you think about, people behave differently in different settings. They do. Like, I use different language around my students or around my grandparents than I do around my friends or in casual contexts or off air. And we all do it. My language use disintegrates and becomes very sailor-like when I'm not being recorded. And like, we're all like that. We have different contexts, right? But there are some things that are never cool, no matter what the context. And you have to think about, what environment am I creating? What am I allowing to happen just because no one's getting hurt by hearing it? But maybe it does hurt people to let it go.
And how do you know they're not hearing it? Because beyond race, it's really difficult to know who's a minority in the room. Like you can tell that someone's black on site, you can tell that someone's a woman, but you can't tell who's gay. You can't always tell by looking who's got a disability. So, I've been in the room where people have been insulting queer people, not realizing that I'm gay, and that sucks. So there's a really great video by David Morrison from the Australian Army with the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. And that's just such a good way to look at things. If you're not prepared to call someone out for something, that's what they're going to keep doing. So you have to make that decision. What are you prepared to stand up for or put up with?
Yeah. And it's true whether you're in a meeting with the people that you're supposed to be an ally to, or whether you're having a beer with someone who makes very funny off-color comments because they're not PC. You're still tolerating something. If you wouldn't tolerate it in front of your friend that comment is insulting, you shouldn't tolerate it when they're not there.
So if you're going to make jokes that make marginalized people feel less comfortable, that's probably not okay, and you should think about maybe not doing that. But the other thing about this whole situation is that mostly there are HR processes for dealing with the really overt bad behavior, and mostly it doesn't happen, or people deal with it because they're like, oh my god, that just happened, I need to do something about it. And it's the low level stuff that is really difficult to deal with. Mm-hmm. And partly it's a kind of gaslighty, I'm the only person in the room that thinks that's bad, am I just exaggerating? And the constant message that women and minorities get, that you're being sensitive, it was just a joke, that can make you feel like you're going mad a little bit to think that this stuff isn't cool. The problem I have is something will happen, I'll be like, wow, did that just happen? And by the time I figured out that was not cool and this is why it's not cool, everything's moved on. And it's really difficult to be like, rewind that thing. There was a meeting with a whole bunch of guys and a woman. The woman said something, everyone's like, nah, that's rubbish. 5 minutes later, a guy said exactly the same thing. Everyone's like, oh, that's great. And a little bit later, he's like, wait, guys, that's what she said. So there's a lot of value in saying, hang on, that thing just happened. Can we rewind and talk about it? Even if you don't catch it in the moment, you can still have a conversation about it afterwards.
Yeah.
And maybe people didn't realize that it happened.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, what's the hardest is that I will say I'm very rarely treated in an overtly sexist way. Very, very, very rarely will anybody in my life be like, oh, well, you're a woman, so boo on you. Like that, it almost never happens. But I definitely know when I'm being dismissed. And I definitely get that subtle feeling sometimes that a man would rather get an opinion from another man, or thinks that maybe I don't quite know what I'm talking about. It's that little edge of lack of trust. And it's one of those things that's so hard to talk about, because if somebody else were there, they might not even have seen it or felt it. It's something that because you're on the receiving end of it, but nobody else can even see it. And it makes you feel nuts.
So Stephen Downes Martin, he recommended a book at Connections North, The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense at Work. And it's about how the words can be perfectly fine, but the way they're delivered is the slippery bit, the tone and the intention.
That, yes.
And that's what I'm constantly having to explain to people. And it's also a really good thing to keep in mind when you're trying to address people saying rubbish things. And you can get caught up in having semantic debates with them, but it's not about the semantics, it's about the politics and the assumptions behind those semantics. So like when people start to argue nasty transphobic things about, but biological sex is real, and it's like that's not up for debate. Trans people deserve equality. That's the only thing we're going to talk about.
Right, like quit shifting the platform. Does this person have personhood and rights to their own life or not? What do you think?
Yeah, and if you can figure out what the presumption behind the tone is and ask that question instead, right, it derails the trolling pretty effectively, and it can often get them to admit the rubbish.
Yeah, for me, my favorite de-escalation thing, I mostly use it with kids because that's who I mostly have issues with, because I work in a school.
I'm not sure it's all that different.
my favorite thing to say to anybody that I'm in an argument with, though, is, so what do you want from this interaction? What is your goal in having this argument? What do you hope will come of it?
Yeah, and then, like, how everything you're doing is just not meeting that goal right now if you're being rude to me.
Yeah, well, the other thing is that it always like stops people because it's a weird question to ask when you're in the heat of something, and so it either makes them realize like, wait, what are my motivations, or they realize like that they've strayed really, really far from what they meant. And I like it because it forces a slowdown in the conversation. I mean, it won't work every time, but I really like that one because it also, like, if the person is really dealing with you in good faith, then it often makes them stop being aggressive and start being more reflective. If they're in bad faith, they don't want to tell you what the intention was, and then you know. So.
Yeah. And when you're having the, like, not people being like malicious, but just like misunderstanding conversations and collisions of like, we're talking across purposes, that like, what's the story you're telling right now? Because there's usually a whole thing that's not being said that makes you really angry with me because I'm not doing what you want, but I have no idea what it is you expect from me right now, and I'm thinking over here something completely different.
Yeah, and I think that actually one of the things that we can do moving forward as we try to have more diversity and communicate in more diverse groups is to be more mindful of how we're communicating. Why did I choose to say this? Am I being upset by something that I brought to the table instead of the other person? You know, when we talk, actually, you know, I think it also goes back to correcting without shame and stuff like that, right? You know, we think about, you know, we need to all be clear about where we're coming from, what our intentions are, what we want to change, and not let it get spun out into something that it isn't.
And just be really willing to be like, I made a mistake. I did, you know, you're offended, I'm sorry. And not, I'm sorry if you're offended, I'm sorry if that upset you, just, I'm sorry, I'll do better. And listen to what it was that didn't go down well, and having that growth mindset. So I was reading a book recently. Let me just look up what it's called, because that would be bad to reference a book by a woman and then not remember her name. Dolly Chug, Chug, and it's The Person You Mean to Be. And it's all about how we should stop thinking of ourselves as good people and think of ourselves as trying to become better people. So it's okay to not be perfect, and you can mess up, because everyone will, and then have exactly the opposite of all the things that you meant. And like, they weren't saying every bone in your body is racist. They're like, you said this one word that you didn't understand, didn't mean a good thing to this other person in this context. Here's a little bit of feedback. And like, all of these skills that we're talking about are really good for wargaming, because we're having conversations with people and we're talking about difficult things, and we're trying to understand complicated things and not upset each other, and try to have new perspectives on things. So it's all like, it's making us better at communicating and understanding each other, which can only be good.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about this from the perspective of people trying to attract a more diverse set of people into wargaming, and also people within who are trying to negotiate new and more diverse waters. What would you say, if you could give advice to a woman or to someone else who's in a minority group who is interested in coming into professional wargaming? What advice would you give?
Ooh, good question. Try and have the confidence of a mediocre white man. Because like, so much stuff in my career, I've been like, I don't quite know enough yet. I'm not quite qualified enough yet. Are they sure they mean me? That's not really, I'm sure they didn't, you know, that's not really a space for me yet. I don't have enough experience behind me. And like, just, there are bucket loads of guys behind me that know less and understand less and have done less, that just like, yeah, I'll do it. Or who will even be like, I worked near her, so I'm going to claim credit for the kind of stuff that she's done. You know, like people that have like crossed a T on a project have been like, I did that whole project. Yeah, that's my credit. And like, it's so frustrating. So, and it's really difficult for women and minorities, because we're constantly being told, like, don't boast about yourself, you know, it's not polite. That's bragging, and it's unbecoming in women. And like, you got to get good at bullshitting and not feeling bad about it. And it's so hard. And I still feel like, can I really say that? And it's much easier to prod other women to do those things. Like, yeah, do it, because the men would be doing it. So I guess the second thing is to find other people like you that can do that egging on with you and be like, no, you need to say that thing because the men will be saying that.
That is great advice. And one softball question to kind of to bring this to an end. What are you playing for fun right now?
Right now, I'm writing my own game. So in 1945, there was Ren-powered VR. So they'd have like a planetarium dome, and there'd be a projector with cinefilm and like film of dive bombing aircraft, and there'd be a Ren with a mirror projecting it around the ceiling. And one of the naval officers would have a gun and it'd be trying to shoot down the aircraft as like anti-aircraft training. And I found some photographs and then some film footage of this, and some of the original domes still exist in the UK, which is kind of cool. And I've done similar things in VR, but I thought, I could make a smartphone game of this. So I've been playing around with using the gyro in a smartphone to move a camera around, and then tap the screen to fire the gun. So this week I've been playing with trying to get Spitfires and Messerschmitts to dogfight each other with some really simple AI, which is quite fun. They're really stupid, but they do sort of follow each other and shoot each other, and eventually they explode. And it looks good enough for the ground, so that's fine for me.
Oh, that's awesome. And I know that you are a mysterious person, but where can you be found on the internet that you're willing to have people find you?
So I'm one of the co-editors on Paxims. So do you want to put the URL in the description or something?
Yeah, there will be several URLs in the box.
Yeah, so you can catch me on there, or I have occasional articles on the Waiver Room, places like that. I'm sure there'll be more in future.
No social media?
Mostly. No, I'm a woman of mystery on social media.
Oh my gosh, you're a saint. All right. And then I can be found anywhere, everyone, as Beyond Solitaire. Sally, thank you so much for coming on and spending this time with us. But yeah, it's been fantastic to talk to you.
Awesome.
Happy gaming, everybody.